Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
All right, welcome back to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. I am here with our host, Sucheta Kamath, a second conversation with Dr. Peg Dawson. Looking forward to that. But before we go there, Sucheta, you're going to tell us a story about Guy Ritchie. I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, Todd, I am going to share a story about Guy Ritchie. So not everyone at age 9 knows that they want to be a firefighter or a doctor or the president of the United States. In fact, many youngsters struggle in finding themselves. It's our brain's maturation that truly holds them back. Recently, I heard Guy Ritchie's interview. He's the famous filmmaker whose first film, Lock, Stock, and the Two Smoking Barrels, was a breakout hit. He talks about his own story this way. So growing up, Guy Ritchie struggled with dyslexia and attended a number of different schools. Eventually, at age 15, he dropped out of school for having been caught using drugs. And that's the main reason why he was asked to leave. When asked about his dream of becoming a filmmaker at a young age, Guy Ritchie says, "I'm not sure if I was so focused as to thinking about being a filmmaker at that time. Rather," he said, "I was focused on dropping out of school." So after dropping out of school, Guy began to sell drugs. And he fondly says that it's very hard to be a successful drug dealer, as I found out. If you ask me, the very thing that is needed to be successful in school is also needed in selling drugs and making a profit. So interestingly, after bouncing from one place to another and one idea to another, Guy Ritchie finally landed in the film industry at around age 25. His first gig, in fact, was a tea boy. He brought tea to people. And of course, you can imagine that's a very British thing to do. I was enthusiastic about it, literally from the day one. Once I started, I did not stop working. That's what Guy described about his transition from a tea boy to eventual small productions and the short film that he produced after that. I heard Guy Ritchie say that it's in nothing else did I sustain any motivation or interest. But as soon as I got interested, as soon as I started in the film business, I was off to the races. So Guy Ritchie's story is a testimony to maturing prefrontal system. Once it comes on, it provides focus, engagement, and a desire to persist. Guy Ritchie said in his closing conclusion during his interview that if there is one piece of advice I would give anyone, it is do not sweat until you're 25. There seemed to be something that takes place in the brain at 25 when you have had a quarter of century of arsing around and learning about life. So our guest, Peggy Dawson, is going to talk about the journey of struggling children and youth who need more than just life's bumps to ultimately discover their strengths or to be able to channel themselves towards personal success. So I would love to introduce you to Dr. Peg Dawson for her part 2 of the interview. She is an outstanding school psychologist, and she has done some very impactful work in this field of executive function diagnosis and treatment. Dr. Dawson has worked at the Center for Learning and Attention Disorder in Portsmouth, New Hampshire for over 25 years, where she specialized in the assessment of children and adults with learning and attention disorders. Dr. Dawson is most known for her Amazon bestseller book, Smart But Scattered, which she co-authored with Dr. Richard Guare, a book every parent and educator must read. They also have a new book that has just come out, which I highly recommend as well. Dr. Dawson is a past president of both National Association of School Psychologists and International School Psychology Association. In 2010, Dr. Dawson was a recipient of the International School Psychology Association's Distinguished Service Award, and in 2006, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Association of School Psychologists. And in closing, I want to just remind people that her work is informed by her personal experiences, not just as a school psychologist, but raising 2 boys who also struggled a little bit in the area of executive functions. And she, as a parent, learned a lot from them. So I can't wait for a conversation with Peg Dawson.
Yeah, me as well. And a fascinating story about Guy Ritchie. I did not know that about his background. And I, too, am looking forward to your second conversation with Dr. Peg Dawson. And boy, thinking again about Guy Ritchie, my career took a big change at around 25 years of age as well. So that's a fascinating tidbit. So, all right, well, let's get to it. So this is Sucheta's second conversation with Dr. Peg Dawson.
Welcome again, Peg, to our show. Thank you so much for taking time away from your busy schedule. So let's get started. In this segment, I want to talk about executive function and managing executive dysfunction. So what will happen if we don't intercept in the process of developing executive functions, particularly when they're falling behind?
Okay, so the brain is constructed so that executive skills do mature gradually over time as the brain develops new capacities. But some kids do better than others on this. And when kids fall behind in terms of executive skill development, they become increasingly disadvantaged in school because the longer you stay in school, the more school requires you to use not only executive skills in general, but requires you to use higher level executive skills like time management and planning and organization and those kinds of things. So if kids fall behind, then there's a mismatch between teacher expectation and what kids are capable of doing. And then they may start failing, but they also start feeling frustrated. Their parents are frustrated, and they're not able to keep up with the academic demands because those academic demands rest on proficient executive skills.
In my experience, what we see is if they're not managed, first of all, if you don't call it what it is, people are left to reconcile to think that these problems of not managing me is a more indication of something less in me. And so people either implode or people explode. So there are a lot of behavioral mismanagement that emerges if you don't address it. Do you often see that?
Yeah, and I see it in two ways. There are the more externalizing kinds of manifestations. So those are kids who become disruptive or visibly frustrated. And then there are kids who stop producing or producing at a slow rate or producing poor quality. Those kids we often end up calling lazy. And of all the words out there used to describe kids with executive skill challenges, I think I bristle most at the word lazy because it implies that it's a character flaw as opposed to probably some weak executive skills that if we focused on them, maybe we could bolster them and the child would stop appearing lazy after a while.
So I hope our listeners really understand that it's extremely essential that we do everything in our capacity to promote development of executive functions. And the more support we offer, this can expedite or even prevent, in some cases, of falling behind. What is the framework you conceptualize when we are managing executive function challenges? How should we go about it?
Well, I think we've got three options. And one is we can look at that mismatch between the environment or environmental expectations, be they from parents or teachers, and the child's executive skill level and say, okay, we've got to support this child so that he's not failing. And so we don't necessarily try to change the child at this point. We just adapt our expectations and adapt tasks to better meet what the child is capable of. So if a child really has trouble with sustained attention and asking him to spend 30 minutes on a classwork assignment or a homework assignment, that may be unrealistic. So can we break it down into smaller segments? Can we build in small breaks? Can we build in something to make the task more appealing to the child? So we're not trying to change the child at that point. And that's always where we start. We say, what can we do to make the environment more supportive or less punishing to the child?
And this is different from lowering expectations.
Yeah, it is, because our goal is always to get the child to his most competent, independent self. But if we start by expecting more that he's capable of doing, then all we're going to do is produce failure. So we may start out with the child, okay, eventually we want to get you to be able to do all your homework within a reasonable amount of time, but we're going to take it slowly initially and build up to there.
I like the way you distinguish that we are not talking just modifying environment, which is, turn off the TV or create a quiet space. You're talking about environmental modification includes modifying expectations. I really like that. What was the second option?
Sure. So the second option is to actually look at the behavioral or skill deficit and say, can we put a routine in place that will help this child get through that? So let's say you have a child who has a terrible time getting ready for school in the morning because he gets distracted, he dawdles, or he forgets what he's supposed to do. So if we create a checklist or even use a smartphone app, and there's some good ones out there that help a kid get through a morning routine. If we have the child go through that routine again and again and again, he's actually learning the routine. So the routine actually supports task initiation, sustained attention, planning, everything else. So that's the second way. And in Smart But Scattered, we have a whole chapter devoted to teaching strategies that are built around common everyday routines that kids need to learn. And we identify which executive skills are incorporated into those routines, but they're things parents can actually use almost off the shelf. So that would be the second way.
Got it. So here's my observation, which I have a perspective on this, that if you came up with a list of things for the student or the child, and if the child has to follow, then your executive functions went into it. And one of the things that might prevent transfer or generalization to other situations is the child has never learned the principles of how to generate that list. So how do you propose we compensate and break down in that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's how our thinking has evolved actually since we wrote Smart But Scattered, because we realized there are two ways of teaching kids executive skills. One is to give them the routine and walk them through the routine. But the other way, which we do think is better, is to say, you know what, we've got a problem with getting ready for school in the morning. Let's think about what needs to go into that. And let me get your ideas on how we could work on that. And so now you're actually engaging the child at the problem solving level or the planning level, rather than you just handing them a plan. You're saying, we need to come up with a plan. And the child has some input into that. In fact, some of my favorite ways to talk to kids, if they present a dilemma or a problem, is to say, well, what's your plan? Do you have a plan for that? And that sort of puts it back on them, so they have to generate the strategy of the plan.
One of the ways I introduced this concept of planning and creating a list. So to list is something that to me is a predetermined sequence of events that repeat themselves. And I like to contain them to 5 steps. And then we go through this process of what is inviolate. Like if you are in crisis and you are running out of time, out of those 5 steps, which 2 steps can never be let go. And so kind of helping kids to do that kind of problem solving. So when they generate the list, that this principle is kept in mind. And I find that that helps develop that underpinning cognitive ability.
Yeah, I like that. That's great.
So what's the third option?
So the third option is actually finding ways to motivate your child to use the strategies that you're trying to teach them. And so we talk about, can you use incentives? I mean, one of the most powerful ways to encourage kids to practice is to build in simple routines like first work, then play. So first they practice whatever skill they need to practice, and then whatever is on their preferred list of activities, that follows that. So one of the most effective is, kids who love to play video games, that's fine. You can play half an hour video games, but first you get your homework done. Or you get your homework done by 7:00 if you're working on kids working in an efficient fashion. And if you do get your homework done by 7:00, then you get to play half an hour of video games. And then sometimes it comes down to, well, the child does his homework by 7, but it's a mess and it's full of mistakes. So then as a parent, you say, okay, homework has to be done by 7:00. And when I glance at it, I don't want to see more than 2 or 3 mistakes. And so those are ways to build in consequences that encourage the child to engage in or practice whatever behaviors we're working on. A lot of parents have resistance to that because, I hear parents all the time saying, I don't want to pay my kid to do something they should want to do anyway. But my feeling about the use of incentives is we're trying to build in practice. We're trying to entice kids to spend time practicing skills that may not be easy for them, that actually may be aversive to them. And if incentives enable them to get that practice time in, then to me, they're worth considering.
So when you say incentive, it could be an actual financial reward, it could be a sticker, or it could be time given to play a video game. So it's a very specific, concrete reward given immediately after completion, correct?
Yes, although we also, whenever possible, are building in social reinforcers as well. So
can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that would be letting the child know what he's done. man, you stuck with that homework. You didn't get distracted. You got it done on time. Terrific. So now what you're doing is you're giving the child positive feedback about the behaviors that are associated with the executive skills you're trying to teach or trying to encourage. So the more specific you can be in terms of positive feedback to kids, and you can even use terms like goal-directed persistence. Whoa, that puzzle was tough for you. You stuck with it. You know what that's called? That's called goal-directed persistence. I'm impressed with how hard you worked. So those kinds of statements.
What I find about this work, it requires parents and educators to be so pro psychology. They need to have a very deep understanding of human behavior. And many people struggle with that, Peg. Do you find that they're not as intuitive as one might think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, what the research shows in terms of positive feedback is that if you can achieve a ratio of 3 positives to every corrective feedback, that alone can change behavior, which sounds very simple. But in actual practice, it's something that even skilled people don't necessarily achieve. My colleague went into preschools a few years ago and looked at the ratio of positive to corrective feedback in preschools. And most people think of preschool teachers as being the most positive people out there.
Exactly.
And because there's not the demands for academic performance that you find once kids hit elementary school. But what they found was the typical ratio was 3 correctives to 1 positive. And the best teachers they came across were ones who had a 1-to-1 correspondence.
Wow.
So it is something that doesn't come naturally. On the other hand, when I've talked with other people who've managed to persuade parents or teachers to use that strategy, they report very quick results. So it's not something that comes naturally, but it is something that can be learned, and it can produce pretty dramatic results in a pretty short time.
I use the lens of social psychology and social cognition research. My favorite reference that I bring in is Baron Cohen's research, which is empathy erosion. That means when we start the day, for example, we have great empathy and compassion, and our empathy erodes with time and roadblocks, and particularly negative responses or pushback. And so a parent who starts with a great gung-ho and great desire to provide these incentives and feedback kind of experiences empathy erosion, and they become impatient and short and intolerant of faux pas. And that's when the real crux of the matter is, how do you redirect yourself? Going back to your reference in the earlier podcast about one's own executive functions need to be kept in check when you're reacting to or redirecting somebody's poor executive function responses. So how do parents themselves intensivize themselves so that they can be more appropriate when they're responding to challenging situations?
Let me come at that from a different direction, because I'm often asked by parents how to help manage their kids when they recognize that they have executive skill challenges. I mean, I will have a parent say to me, you know what, I have ADHD, I have an attention disorder, my kid has an attention disorder. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to carry out all the strategies that you're suggesting there. And so I generally have 2 responses. It'd be interesting to get your reaction to this. The first response is stop beating yourself up, because none of us are perfect. In fact, I remember my mentor in graduate school, I observed him teaching parenting classes one semester. And he said one thing to those students that has stuck with me ever since. He said, a good parent is a parent who makes the right decision 51% of the time. And who knows? That. I'm sure he just drew that percentage out of his head, but as a parent, you immediately react and say, oh, well, I can do that. The other recommendation I give to parents, because again, anyone who's read our book will see that there are all kinds of strategies out there that may take considerable time in order to use them effectively. But I often tell parents, rather than using an elaborate system that might involve rewards or might involve kids earning points or money or whatever, can you think of something that you could do every day that wouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes that you could continue to use as long as you needed to? That is far more effective than the most elaborate reward system, because you can't keep those up over time. And so basically, I mean, as an example, the way I got my son with an attention disorder through high school was, first of all, I narrowed my goal, and when I thought about all the things I wanted him to accomplish by the time he graduated from high school, I zeroed in on 2. I said, I'd like him to complete his homework on time and hand it in. And so those were the things I focused on through high school. And when he came home from school every day, I asked him 2 questions. What do you have to do? When are you going to do it? It was rarely more than a 5-minute conversation, but I kept it up day in and day out. I think I faded it by his senior year because he didn't need me to be asking that anymore. And I had, I've told the story a lot. So if anybody's listening to your podcast, they will hear this story again. I had no idea what strategies were effective with my son because I was using all kinds of things until he was 28. And at age 28, he told me this story that enlightened me. I mean, he basically said, and he was really irritated when he told me the story. He said, "Mom, it wasn't until I was 25 that I stopped going through this mental homework checklist at the end of every day." and so, I mean, he graduated from college at 22 and didn't start graduate school until 26. So there were 3 years in there where that mental homework checklist was useless to him. And that's why he was telling me that way. But that was where the light bulb went on for me. I said, okay, so that was something I did, 5 minutes a day from 8th grade through his senior year in high school. And obviously it paid off. In fact, I just talked to him a few months ago. He's 37 now. And he said, Mom, even now when I'm stressed, I fall back on that mental homework checklist.
No, I love it, Peg. I think your point is absolutely right. One thing that I have found useful, particularly parents who really get stressed out about not knowing how exactly to be effective, is I highly recommend people to video record their children as a feedback and not to watch it right then and there, but to create, let me show you what I see and what is it that you want me to do about it. So kind of bringing them back into the problem solving for themselves, but from a perspective of many people, not just for himself.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to resist mom or dad. But when you see what mom and dad are going through when they're dealing with you, maybe there's an opportunity to see the situation with greater compassion.
Yeah, I like that.
So that is such a wonderful discussion, Peg. Thank you for your wisdom and so many points we didn't get a chance to talk about. But I really appreciate you explaining from a perspective of handling executive functions from being an expert as well as a mom. So any parting thoughts regarding what is one thing that you always want people to remember when they think about dealing with complex set of skills of executive functions?
Yeah, again, I have to come back to, let's look at this as skills that can be strengthened as opposed to character flaws that you blame kids for. If we can do that, then I think we're on the right track.
Well, thank you for ending with a message of hope that this can be managed and this can be learned and this can be developed. If people want to reach you, what's the best way to get hold of you?
I think the best way is to go to our website, which is smartbutscatteredkids.com. There's an email link that you can contact me, but there are also a lot of other resources on the website, including links to our books and descriptions of the books if people want those, but also some free downloadable materials as well. So they may want to take a look at that.
Thank you, Peg, for being on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. Thanks for contacting me.
All right, we are back, and wow, another great conversation with Dr. Peg Dawson, Sucheta. She has been a joy to have on the show. One of the things that you two talked about was this idea that executive functions have become much more relevant for success in school and, of course, beyond. And Dr. Dawson certainly warns that if we do not help our children with these issues, it can have severe consequences, right?
They certainly can. And as you saw the way I asked the question, that what is the risk that we run when we don't intercept, when we know the child is struggling or is having difficulty in becoming independent or skilled? And she was quite clear that even though we understand that these skills take time to mature and they don't all emerge at the same time, the biggest risk we run in formal years of learning is the child will fall behind. And increasingly, this can create a great sense of stress and disappointment with the child's progress and success. And the things that I'm most concerned about is that during the formal years of learning, at least the skills that we are needing to see emerge are in the area of executive functions, but a lot of formal educational components are also mastered through practice, through executive function mastery. So these students, when they leave high school or leave college, they may come out at the other end without truly having mastery. And that can create a disadvantage for their workforce entry or their capacity to become a gainfully employed citizen of this world.
Well, what I thought was a very important segment of your second conversation with Dr. Dawson was she presented 3 options to help manage executive functions. So I think it'd be great if you would review those with us.
Certainly, I would be happy to. And one thing, again, our listeners need to really take it to heart that her message, my message, and all the experts that are out there who do important work with executive function, there's a great common mistake that happens, which is students who are underproducing, underachieving, or they're producing poor quality of work, or they stop producing altogether, often run a risk of being called lazy. And lazy is a character flaw. And lazy indicates that you have all the capacity and skill. You're choosing to defy. You're choosing to resist. You're choosing to oppose. And that is not true. And that's why we need to pay careful attention to how we support. And I love the framework she gave. So the first takeaway of managing executive functions is to environmental expectations, to modify environmental expectations. One thing that she means by that is to really teach students or kids how to adapt the response to the task that they're working with. If the entire task is too large, then what is allowable and producible? So, for example, if you expect your child to make the bed, and if the child is not making the bed, then the first step, it may be just to you make the bed and have the child put the pillow on it. So what you're doing is you are maintaining the task engagement, but you have taken away the load. And this taking away the load is guaranteeing engagement. And second, it's also breaking it into smaller parts. And so I see that as a very valuable way of managing the productivity and kind of having a place where you can always start. She also pointed out that this is not lowering expectations. In fact, it is opposite of that. It is actually tweaking expectations. So you are creating skills that go into meeting the expectations. The second takeaway I thought was really critical is the actual skill development. And she believes that one can do that through managing behaviors and promoting the skill set that will compensate for the deficit. And she has some really nice suggestions about that. And the last part she talks about is how to work on motivation and how do we motivate the child to engage in strategy use. And this is another very critical part in managing executive functions. And in my talks and in my work, I always point out that it's very easy to tell kids what to do. And if you're telling the kids what to do, your own executive functions go into it. And that's not what's going to help the child to develop the executive functions needed. So she has nice suggestions to engage the child's motivation to see value in the strategy that I provided, and eventually a possible way of shifting that focus so the strategic thinking can be taught through problem solving as well. So these were the important takeaways that I found that were very relevant. The last part I will say, which is a takeaway for parents, that parents might find themselves ineffective working with students or children with executive function challenges because there's not consistency. And quite often, to be honest with you, there's a lot of resistance. So she has some suggestions for parents that, number one, she said not to beat up on yourself. If you're not getting kind of cooperation, to kind of be forgiving of yourself. And the second point that she made was also very important, which is, where are you going to be consistent? So focus on the area where you can guarantee your own consistency. So coming up with elaborate systems that you cannot keep up with probably is not the best idea. So something simple where you can be effective simply because you're consistent is a great takeaway. So I think it's a wonderful conversation. I recommend those who have missed the previous conversation to go back and listen to part one. But Todd, it was really empowering conversation that can add great value for our listeners.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And if I'm a parent, or frankly, even an educator who is dealing with children or students that have issues with the executive functions, this was in fact a great conversation to really give you some keen insights as to how to move forward. So great stuff. All right. Well, that is it for today's episode in our second conversation with Dr. Peg Dawson. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thanks for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.